Now that we've covered the theory behind the naive Bayes classifier in detail, it's time to get our hands dirty and write some Python code. In this lesson, we've got a big and important topic coming up, namely how to get your code to talk to your computer's operating system. How do you read a file? Now, a lot of this knowledge is going to be transferable to whatever programming language you're working in and whatever project you're working in. But with Python and machine learning, you're going to be working with a lot of data, and that data is going to be stored somewhere. Most likely, that's going to be stored locally on your computer, or it's going to be stored on a server. For many of our projects, our Python code is going to need to interact with our own computer's operating system and actually be able to read the files from the disk. So while we're on this topic about learning how to read files, we're also going to cover quite a few other topics as well, namely file paths, file locations, file extensions. We're also going to see how our email data is actually structured, and we're also going to see how we can extract a message body from a raw email. But first things first, whenever you're referencing a file in your Python code, you're going to need to specify exactly where that file is and what that file is called. And this means you have to specify two things, namely the file path and the file name. In the lesson resources that you've downloaded and added to your projects folder, I included a practice email. So taking a peek inside the spam data folder and then opening 01 processing, you should see a file called practice_email.txt. Now, the file name for this file should be pretty obvious because we're looking right at it. It's practice_email.txt. That txt part is called the file extension, and this signals what kind of file this is. A txt file is just a boring old text file. But the thing is, these file extensions are key to the computer or you or me understanding what kind of file it is that we're working with. The extension tells us something about a file's format. So, for example, Microsoft Word documents have the extension DOC or DOCX, and PDFs have the extension .pdf. Windows executable files, on the other hand, have the very dangerous extension .exe. So if you ever receive an email that has an attachment with a .exe extension, don't open the attachment. This was always the classic way that people installed viruses on their computers back in the day. Now, I was going through my spam directory recently, and one thing I noticed actually was that more and more folks are sending out their malicious code with the .js or JavaScript extension instead of .exe. So yeah, it's always good to pay close attention to these file extensions. Now that we've talked about the file name and the file extension, what about this other thing that I've mentioned? What about the path? The path, or the file path, is the location of the file. Let me quickly show you how you can actually view the file path on Mac, and afterwards I'll show you how to see it on Windows. If you're using a Mac, then you can open Finder, and you can go to this practiceemail.txt file in Finder, and then you can go to File, Get Info, or Command I. And what you can see right here is the location of this file. It's on my hard drive, under my username, inside my projects folder, then spam data, and then 01_processing. This here is the location of the practice_email.txt file. This right here is my file path. If you're running Windows, on the other hand, you can always see the file path and the location in this address bar right up here. So right now, this is the projects folder. Double-clicking on spam data will open my folder, and you can see now that the location here has updated. If I open processing, then I can clearly see the full file path to this practice email right here in my address bar. If I click inside the address bar, then we can see the names of the folders and the subfolders separated by a backslash. In other words, my processing folder is inside spam data, which is inside my projects folder, which is inside my username folder under users, and then on my C drive. This long piece of text that we're looking at right here is the full path. And this brings me to the two different kind of paths that you'll be encountering. The first one is actually called an absolute path. Think of the absolute path as the long form. This is the full path to the file or folder. On Windows, you often see the absolute path starting with C and then going to your particular user profile and then down to a particular folder. On Mac, the absolute path to the practice email would look something more like this. Alright, I think that's easy enough. But while the absolute path is the long form, there's also a shorthand. You see, you don't always have to work with an absolute path. Instead, you can work with what's called a relative path. A relative path uses your current location as the starting location and then points to a file or folder from there. So suppose I'm in my ML projects folder in Finder. Then the relative path to the practice email would be spam data, 01 processing, and there it is. There's my practice_email.txt file. As such, the relative path from my ML projects folder to my practice_email.txt file would look something like this. What you're looking at here is actually the formatting for Windows. On a Mac, you'd have a relative path that would look more like this. Notice the only difference are the slashes. Mac uses the / and Windows uses the / in front of the file and folder names. Now, this might be a small thing to point out, but the direction of the slashes actually matters when you're writing your Python code. So even though in Windows you see backslashes used in the path on the address bar, it's actually a little problematic to try and just copy-paste what's in here. And the reason is that in Python, you actually want to use a / because the backslash has a special purpose in the Python programming language. Let's fire up a new Python notebook and I'll show you exactly what I mean and why we want to use /. In Jupyter, navigate to your ML projects folder and then click New Python 3 Notebook. Let's rename this notebook to 06 Bayes Classifier and click Rename. Say we print a line, "What is up?" and hit Shift Enter. Then we see this text printed below. But what if we wanted to write "What's up?" So if I wanted to write "What's up?" with an apostrophe, you can see that I now have 3 single quotes in this string. And that means that my string starts here, ends here, and this part onwards here is considered Python code, and then it starts another string here. In other words, Python needs to know that it should ignore this single quote. And for that, we use the /. The / escapes the character that follows it. So by using the /, this single quote here is treated as part of the string, and if I hit Shift Enter, I can get that apostrophe to show up in my output. And that's also why when you're providing a path as a string, you want to make sure you use / instead of backslashes that you get from copy and pasting from the Windows address bar. Okay, so much for the theory behind relative paths, file names, file extensions, and absolute paths. In the next lesson, I'll show you how to read that practice email into Jupyter Notebook. I'm going to go ahead and get some coffee, but I hope I'll see you in the next lesson.